It's step up its attempts to woo Clive Palmer. They could take a few tips from the South Australian Labor government, which successfully enticed a former Liberal leader to their side of politics.
Well, for more on this and some of the other top stories of the week, we're joined by our news commentators. Managing Director of the Campaigns and Communications Group, Bruce Hawker, and the Research Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, Chris Berg. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the news we've been following this morning on the search for flight MH370. Bruce, what do you make of the efforts to find the plane and also the politics of it? We heard again yesterday the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, having a bit of a dig at the Prime Minister, saying we should stop the commentary and just stick with the search, let the professionals do the job.
Well, I was a little surprised at the time when the Prime Minister injected himself so much into that story. I was overseas watching it, and of course CNN and all the other news agencies were covering it. I kept seeing Tony Abbott on the TV, which I thought was quite interesting and a little surprising. But, you know, that doesn't it's not all that much out of the box, really, for a Prime Minister to be involved in the story at that moment. But of course the downside is that when it looks like you're in the wrong area, you're not going to find the aircraft there, then people obviously want to say, well, you know, what are you going to say now? What are you going to do now? Or are you just going to leave it up to the professionals to get on with the job? But having said all that, I don't really make too much of it. I don't think it's a make or break event for Tony Abbott. I think much more pressing issues at the moment for him.
Chris, what do you make of it? Tough position, I would think, for the Prime Minister, given Angus Houston was so adamant that that was the final resting place of the plane.
Well, I mean, that was the best information apparently they had at the time. I can't imagine the hypothetical situation where Tony Abbott wasn't out in front of this incredibly worldwide fascination with the missing plane. I'm certain that we would be sitting here criticising him for not being in front of it enough and not placing Australia in the forefront. When it comes down to it, the best information suggested it was in Australian waters, and therefore it's Australia's responsibility to sort out. I think the geopolitics of this, of course, are also quite interesting, because it isn't just in Australian press conferences that Tony Abbott has been putting us at the forefront of the plane search, but it was a big part of his trip to China a couple of weeks ago, where he made some announcements about how far we were from the plane and so forth, and that was received incredibly well. I think it's the terrible silver lining of this whole tragedy has been the way it's helped Australia and China, particularly, to work together on a wide range of issues and bring those two countries closer.
Well, of course, much more to come on this story. However, let's move to politics of the week. And Bruce, this week I keep seeing an image of Malcolm Turnbull and Clive Palmer emerging from lunch at the restaurant, courting Clive and courting the crossbenchers. Is that what the government trying to do at the moment?
I think so. And of course, Clive Palmer is the hottest date in Canberra at the moment. and for Turnbull to snare him, I think was quite a coup on his part. I mean, I've been interested in Malcolm Turnbull's position on a whole range of things in recent weeks, because I think he's been missing in action when it comes to defending the budget, and suddenly he's
deliberately
emerged.
So?
Well, I think so, yeah.
A deafening silence.
Yeah, and now he's emerged as something of a playmaker with Clive Palmer. Now, Clive was probably just looking for somewhere to tie the old nosebag on, but I think Malcolm actually saw an opportunity here and grabbed it. So I think that's the story that's really of most interest. In some ways, it is an insider story, of course. It's a Canberra story, but in terms of the internal machinations inside the Liberal Party, it might have a little bit more to tell us about what's happening.
And Chris, the other person in that photo, which I thought was fascinating, was Martin Parkinson coming out of that restaurant. Now, what do you make of that? That's a very interesting dinner date.
Well, no, it would have been a fascinating dinner date, and I wish I was there. When you read the initial reports of this, everybody was beating up the secret meeting that they had. I don't think you would have a secret meeting in a Canberra restaurant with two of the most famous people in Australia. That doesn't seem to me to be good strategy. I think this is actually quite smart from the government's perspective. Malcolm Turnbull, in part because of what Bruce was saying, is seen as a little bit of a clean skin in the budget debate. He's seen as a little bit separate to the Abbott leadership. leadership team. So he's a good first step to bring Palmer across the table and bring him back into the fold.
Sorry, and Chris, just before we get on to wooing Clive Palmer, do you agree with Bruce as far as the profile of Malcolm Turnbull in the past couple of weeks? I mean, he has been out of the limelight, hasn't he?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that is very, very clear. Now, there's two parts to that, of course. One is the budget didn't really cover many communications issues, and maybe that was a deliberate decision on Malcolm Turnbull's behalf. But also, I mean, Malcolm Turnbull's been right in the front. He was a big pusher of the deregulation agenda when we were talking about repeal day as well. So, yeah, he has been out of the sphere, but that's in part because Joe Hockey, Matthias Cormann, and Tony Abbott have been taking so much of the spotlight. And of course Christopher Pyne as well, and Peter Dutton, because those are where the policy areas are. We're not talking about the NBN right now because we're talking about the budget.
And Bruce, what do you make of the politics of Clive rolling up to Parley in the Rolls Royce and the Bentley? I mean, sometimes I think humour can be a very powerful tool, and he's really been using it well this week, hasn't he?
I think he's a very interesting character. He's an iconoclast. He's a populist, and of course,
sometimes he seems like an anarchist, a socialist. I'm not sure how you define his politics.
A lot of fun for somebody in the Senate to have those sorts of politics.
And in the media.
Look, I think he knows exactly what he's doing. He wants to be in the limelight. Well, I think he's having a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, but at the end of the day, anti-parliamentarian, hasn't he?
He's the anti-politician.
That appeals to Australians?
Oh, absolutely. Well, to a certain section of the community. So he's playing to a base when he does all these things. He's got a group of people who are unhappy with Labor and the Liberals, and they want somebody in the middle who they can look to as somebody who will show them up for what they are, and that's the sort of politician he is. But let's be in no doubt about how important a role he has to play in the coming term of this government. There are 18 crossbenchers in the Senate, a record, and he controls 4 of those votes. And the government needs 6 really to get their legislation through.
All right, Chris, how does the government woo Clive Palmer?
He may be entirely unwooable, which is both his charm and the problem from the government's perspective. I mean, Clive is the man of the hour, and if Clive dropped the shtick, if Clive stopped being against major party politics, if he started playing ball, he would stop being what is apparently most appealing about him. At the last election, 25% of Australians, or a quarter of Australians, voted against all the major parties, including the Greens. Clive Palmer is the epitome of that anti-politician, that anti-politics push that we're seeing in the current parliament. And if Clive Palmer wants to continue staying relevant, he'd be well advised not to play ball. He'd be well advised to keep throwing up these curveballs whenever he's presented with them. So I think there are certainly ways that they can get some small things through, but Clive Palmer he's in politics to create this havoc. He's not there to deal, as far as I can tell.
And to both of you, what do you make of his relationship with News Corp? He's been quite adamant that they're running a campaign against him. We know what happens sometimes when you become obsessed with media coverage. You can take your eye off the main ball. Bruce, do you see any traps for Mr Palmer?
Well, probably not. I think he fascinates News Corp as well. And, of course, he is a target of a campaign from them. He's right. And as only they can engage in a campaign on the media front in this country, no one else can do it like News Corp can. They're very good at it. They did it to us in the last election campaign. They'll do it to anybody who they really take umbrage with. And I think that's.
But he seems quite masterful at.
He doesn't care.
Playing the straight bat.
That's the thing. He doesn't care.
Right.
So if you don't care, you're not playing by their rules.
You are completely freed from all responsibility. It works out very well for Clive.
It does.
Look, the Australian has done some actually pretty serious exposés on some of Clive's business deals and the issues with some of his mining operations and so forth. And that is serious journalism, and that is important journalism, and Clive's obviously quite upset. Now, you might say, well, the Australian has an interest in doing this investigative journalism, but when it comes down to it, we want newspapers to put politicians' feet to the fire, and that is what is happening with the Clive Palmer stories.
Sure, it's more just about how do you respond. We were talking before about Sarah Ferguson's interview with Dio Wang this week. There's a whole range of people who've, it seems, never had anything to do with the media at all, and it's making politics Very interesting.
Fascinating, and of course, there's a whole world of social media out there that is growing all the time, through which people are having a say.
And Bruce, the government, the federal government, may well do to take the advice of the South Australian Labor government in terms of wooing someone across from the other side. Now, this is exactly what they've done this week with the former Liberal leader, Martin Hamilton-Smith. What do you make of this? Was this purely selfish on his part, do you think?
Well, the Liberal Party in South Australia is more of a social club than than any sort of binding organisation. They've got a history of doing this. Bob Such, who has now taken lead because he's very ill, was a member of the Liberal government and moved over to become an independent, and then supported the Labor Party. Carly Maywell was a National Party MP in South Australia, and she supported Mike Rand, a former government, in 2002. So there does tend to be something of a history of this in the South Australian Liberal Party, which I think they should be very concerned about. But look, none of these things ever end happily for anyone involved in the process, is my view, although people like Such and Carly Maywell were elected again and again, even though they'd left their parties and become independents. But I think it'll be very, very hard for Martin Hamilton-Smith at the next election. I've got absolutely no doubt about that. But it does provide some stability for the government.
And Chris, final word to you. How do you think he'll be treated in the government?
I think he'll be treated poorly in the government. He'll be treated poorly by the opposition. But I think that voters across the spectrum are going to treat not just him poorly, but they're going to treat both sides of politics poorly. For the idea that you can just simply swap from one team to the other, regardless of what values you'd been professing the other day, I think that's a huge condemnation of the entire political class in South Australia, and it looks terrible for all of them, which is why they're all so very upset.
Chris Berg and Bruce Hawker, thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.